Question. Hi Kim, when did we start experimenting with duality? And when did we go fully into it? Was it before we came to Earth, or did it happen after we received our birth trauma? I'm asking these questions in the context of the Course in Abundance, which speaks of this decision where we turned our back on our spiritual teachers. When did we make that decision? Before coming or while being on Earth? Well, the background for the question is that there's a series of 3 books. They're together called A Course in Abundance that really are meant to help you overcome the poverty consciousness and accept and manifest greater abundance in your life, which doesn't necessarily mean physical abundance. So it's a layered question. So I'll take it in stages. When did we start experimenting with duality? Well, I have a video called How the World Was Created, and I explained in there that there are natural planets where we don't have the conflict and warfare and murder and mayhem we see on Earth. And that many spiritual people came from natural planets to Earth so that we can hold a spiritual balance and help move the Earth back to being a natural planet. And so even on a natural planet where there isn't the conflict that we see on Earth, we experimented with the duality consciousness. I've explained this in several videos that we have the 2 options. We can see ourselves as connected beings and seek to expand our connection to our higher self, or we can go into this illusion that we're separate beings. And we use the duality consciousness, which always has 2 polar opposites and a value judgment, one is right, one is wrong, to create this illusion of separation. And part of our growth, as I also explained, the whole world we're in is really an educational institution that is meant to raise our consciousness. And we are in what I call an unascended sphere. I explained this in How the World Was Created. And the importance of that is that we have the option to experiment with the consciousness of separation, because our sphere is not permanent. It hasn't become part of the spiritual realm. So we start out with a certain sense of self, point-like local sense of self, and by interacting with our environment, we grow. And as part of that growth, we have to experiment with everything that can be done with free will. And one of the things can be done with free will is we can go into this illusion we're separate beings, using the duality consciousness to justify why we're separate. And even on a natural planet, we need to experiment with this duality consciousness. Absolutely. Because we need to have a feel for it. Because the reason why we are in an undescended sphere is that it gives us that option, whereas when we ascend and enter the spiritual realm, we don't have the option to use the duality consciousness, go into duality. Because that's what we give up when we ascend. In other words, you can say you have 2 aspects of free will. You can make choices as a connected being whereby you raise up all life, you don't have conflicts with others, and you don't create suffering for yourself. Or you can use your free will as a separate being whereby you will be automatically and unavoidably in conflict with other people, and you will create suffering for yourself and others. And that's what has happened on Earth. Most people have gone into duality, that's why we have all the suffering. So in order to ascend and become part of the spiritual realm, you have to have explored what the duality consciousness is, what it does, and you have to come to a point where you are fully consciously giving it up. You're saying, I'm done with duality, don't want to do it anymore, I want to ascend. That's the whole purpose of an unascended sphere, is to get us to this point where we've had enough of duality and we can ascend into oneness, the Christ consciousness, the Buddha nature. And so even on an unnatural planet, we experiment with it. And again, there are many individual scenarios because people make individual choices. So there are certainly beings who started on a natural planet and made the choice on a natural planet to go into duality and go fully into it, as the question says. When did we start experimenting, and when did we fully go into it? So there are beings who were on a natural planet, they went fully into duality. And then the second part of the question is, when did we turn our back on our spiritual teachers? When you go fully into duality, you turn your back on your spiritual teacher. And you could say this is the cutoff point between you are just experimenting with duality and you are going fully into it, is that you cut off the contact with your spiritual teacher. So we start out experimenting with the duality consciousness, where we can, let's just compare it to, you have a theater, right? And there are certain roles that are defined based on the consciousness of oneness. And then there are certain roles that can be defined based on the consciousness of duality. There's a villain based on the consciousness of duality. There's a hero based on the Christ consciousness, just to make it simple. And so when you start experimenting with a duality consciousness, you are defining your own role through duality instead of through the Christ consciousness. You can also, of course, define your own role through the Christ consciousness. But you're defining your own role. So then you go into the theater, you put on the costume, you play the villain, and then when the play is over, you go back out, take off the costume. Now you talk to your spiritual teacher who gives you feedback, so that you come to see how the duality consciousness works and how it creates a complete illusion, but when you are inside of it, it seems real. But because you've gone outside and contacted the teacher, you haven't become absorbed in it. You haven't become identified with the role you created. That's why you can go in and out of it. And that's why you can go in and out of it until you've had enough of it and you say, okay, that's it. Right? So this means you're experimenting with duality, but you take off the costume, get off the stage, talk to your spiritual teacher who gives you feedback. It's like a tennis player who's playing a match and then afterwards goes over it with the coach and says, yeah, this is where you could have done better, or this, you know. But then when you go fully into duality, you're cutting off your contact with the spiritual teacher. And now you can't go out of it again and get feedback. So how do you get feedback? Through the school of hard knocks, through interacting with other people who are in duality, and you are basically slapping each other in the face until you've had enough of this. So, back to the question. When did we start experimenting with duality? On a natural planet. You know, that's just when we start. When did we fully go into it? Well, some people did go into it on a natural planet. And some of those people ended up on unnatural planets. But as I also explained in my video about how the world was created, the original inhabitants of the earth were the ones who started going into duality, getting lost in duality. And that's why the Ascended Master decided to send both fallen beings and avatars. So the original inhabitants that are already here, that are still here in embodiment, they went into duality when the earth was a natural planet. But then those of us who are avatars, who came from a natural planet, many of us, I would estimate most of us, we didn't go fully into duality on a natural planet. We went into it on Earth in response to what I call, or what the Masters call, the cosmic burst trauma. And I explain that more in my whole playlist about avatar psychology. So if this resonates with you, watch that playlist. So, in other words, if we hadn't gone into duality on a natural planet, we volunteered to come to Earth. We still had a connection to our spiritual teachers. But when we were exposed to this burst trauma, we reacted so strongly to this that we essentially cut off our connection to our spiritual teachers. We went fully into duality, seeing ourselves as separate beings as a response to this trauma. So this wasn't, for avatars, this wasn't because we did something bad or evil. It was because we were exposed to this really severe trauma. And what's important about this is that in order to really get out of it, we have to look at how do we look at spiritual teachers. And I actually have a book called Master Keys to Spiritual Freedom, which was dictated by an ascended master called Lord Maitreya. And Lord Maitreya is traditionally seen as one of the primary spiritual teachers for Earth. And it's sort of symbolized by the myth of the Garden of Eden. You can't take it too literally, but in other words, the God in the Garden of Eden was actually the spiritual teacher for Adam and Eve, who are a symbol for the original inhabitants of the earth. So, so he explains in great detail, on depth in that book, about how we cut ourselves off from the teacher. And it was different for each person. I know when I looked into this, it took me a while. I don't know if I fully got into the bottom of it, but one of the reactions for me was that I felt that I came to Earth not because I wanted to experience what Earth was like. I just wanted to help. So I had this, I wanted to be like the prince on a white horse who rides into town, rescues the damsel in distress and the whole planet. And then when the fallen beings exposed me to this birth trauma, they put me down so severely that it kind of shattered my belief that I could really be the prince on a white horse on Earth. And I reacted so strongly to this that I cut myself off from my spiritual teacher, and I felt, oh, I shouldn't have reacted like this. But now that I have, and it was my responsibility that I reacted this way, I'm going to fix it before I go back to the teacher. So in other words, I'm going to find some way to compensate for going into duality before going back to the teacher. So I can go back to the teacher and say, yeah, I made this mistake, but now I made up for it, so here I am. And this, I think, is probably fairly common among spiritual people. Because when you take a certain responsibility for yourself, you're taking responsibility. I was the one who reacted to the birth trauma here on Earth. It wasn't my spiritual teacher's responsibility, it was my decision. So I want to clean up my mess before I go back to the teacher. But it's, of course, a complete misunderstanding of the purpose of the spiritual teacher. Because the purpose of a spiritual teacher is to help us get out of duality, no matter what we've done in duality. And the teacher doesn't condemn us. There's a little bit of a, there's a little bit of an attitude of that you see so much in the angry and judgmental God that, oh, maybe my spiritual teacher would condemn me for going into duality and making this mistake. But if I clean it up before I go back, then he's not going to do it. But the spiritual teacher is never going to condemn us. The spiritual teacher knows how difficult our planet Earth is, and knows that we are going to have problems. Every other being who has come to Earth has had problems. And so the teacher is always ready to help us. And if we turn our back on the teacher and say, I'm going to clean up my mess before I go back to the teacher, well, we just postpone our return. And sometimes we can postpone it for a long time because, as I've said, you cannot, once you've gone into duality, you can't reason your way out of it from duality. You can only get out of it by connecting to the Christ mind. Now you can connect to the Christ mind without connecting to the specific teacher you had before you went into duality. But you have to find some way to connect to the Christ mind. So you can still have some connection to the Christ mind, or maybe as another teacher. So you're saying, well, I want to clean up my act before I go back to that teacher. But it's still just a misunderstanding of the role of the teacher, which is to help us. I mean, the teacher is outside the theater. We have just gone into the theater and come to identify with a role. But as soon as we become aware of that, we can always go back out and confer with the teacher so we can get help to fully disidentify from the role. That's what the teacher is there for. And if we cut that off, we're just making it much more difficult for ourselves. So what I found was very helpful for me was to start contemplating this. What is my relationship to the concept of a spiritual teacher or a specific spiritual teacher? What is the way I look at it? And I recognized this desire to, as I said, clean up my act before I went back, which is, of course, the complete reverse order of it's the unnatural order of things, because the natural order is that whatever you have done, you connect to the teacher, get the teacher's frame of reference on it, and helps you get out of it much faster. It's again this, what the fallen beings do is they project as a standard, and they project that you coming here as an avatar, you should not have gone below a certain point. This should be beneath you. Therefore, you should have kept your nose clean. And now that you have stuck your nose in the mud, you can never be redeemed. And you should feel ashamed, and you should hide from the teacher instead of going back to the teacher and seeking help to clean it up. You should wait until you cleaned it all up before you go back. And it's just, whatever it is for you individually, you have to contemplate that and see what comes to you intuitively. Ask the Ascended Masters for help to see it. Whichever master you feel you're closest to, ask that master to help you see what caused you to turn away from the teacher and decide to postpone your return to the teacher. Because until you overcome that, well, obviously you can't return to the teacher, but then you can't ascend either, because what is the ascension? Yeah, it's returning to the teacher and your I Am Presence. So as long as you are seeing yourself as separated and you want to keep that distance because you don't want him to see the mess you have, well, you can't return, right? And I think that's what kept many of us stuck on this planet for lifetimes. And there just comes a point where you have to look at this and say, enough of this. I've just had enough of this. Let me just get over it. And then you ask the teacher for help, and you open yourself up. You open yourself up to saying, whatever problems I have, Master, you can look at it. I don't want to hide anything from you anymore. And this took me many years. I mean, I can look back and I can see how I first heard about Ascended Masters in the early 80s in the Summit Lighthouse. I was in the Summit Lighthouse for 15 years or so. And in the Summit Lighthouse, there was this culture, clear culture, that first of all, you thought, you don't really have to look at your psychology. You can just give enough violet flame to transmute your karma, and then you can ascend. But there was also this clear culture that you saw the masters as judgmental beings who would condemn you and demanded discipline. And so therefore, people, they wanted to walk the path, but they thought they could walk the path by hiding. And I was no exception. I also thought this. And it just came a point where I realized the futility of this. I mean, how unrealistic it was. Because, and when I think about this, I realized there was also another aspect of it in me. And there was a certain sense that, as I said, I had made the mistake, I should clean up my mess. But there was also a certain sense, oh, I should be able to do this on my own. And that's actually pride, that's spiritual pride, that you think, oh, I can figure this out on my own, without the teacher's help. I'm smart enough that I can figure this out with the teacher's help. And I can see that tendency. I don't know that everybody has it. Maybe it's just part of me psychologically, but maybe other people have it as well. Or maybe it's just a feature of the ego. I don't know. But I could see it, and I had to deal with it. And it took me a while to deal with it before I saw the utter futility of it, the utter stupidity of it. Because, as I've explained in several videos, getting out of separation means going back into oneness. And that means going back into oneness with the teacher, with your I Am Presence, with the Ascended Masters. There is no other way, right? You can't, from duality, reach such a sophisticated state of a separate self that now you can go to heaven, because now you're perfect. There is no such thing. I mean, the fallen beings think they can do this, but it can't be done, right? It's only a connected self that can ascend to the spiritual realm. And you connect, of course, by connecting to those who are part of the one mind. I mean, there's no way, as a separate being, to do it on your own. It's futility. It's nonsense, nonsensical. You cannot do it on your own. You can only do it by connecting to the whole. And it took me a while to see this, and then there came a point where it was like the scales fell from my eyes, and I really saw the complete utter futility of this. And then, of course, I felt very embarrassed by having thought this way, and so I wanted to hide. I wanted to hide from the teacher that I thought I could do it without. You see what I'm saying? The ego can keep going around and around and around. But then I also came to a point where I saw that. And so the ridiculousness of the ego's always trying to turn everything around so that it looked like I hadn't really done anything wrong. I was really a smart person all along. I was just trying to do it in a certain way and prove a certain point. And it just came a point where I just looked at this whole pile of shit in my subconscious mind, and I said, this is not who I am. I don't want to prove this anymore. I don't want to try and solve this problem. I don't want to prove anything. Just letting the whole ball of wax go down the drain.